Look at your last name on your birth certificate. It may have crossed an ocean before your country existed. It may have stepped off a wooden ship onto a rocky shore before there was a United States to be a citizen of. Some of these names arrived in 1720. Some arrived a full century earlier, when the entire English presence in North America was a few hundred frightened people clinging to a coastline. And a great many of these names never left. They just kept having children. So how do you tell if your name is one of the old ones? How far back does a surname really go before the paper trail runs out? And which one of these 20 names belongs to the very first English family that put down permanent roots on this continent? Let us count them down. One honest word before we start. Genealogy websites love a clean, tidy story. Everybody wants to believe their name landed on a specific ship on a specific day and never wavered since. The real record is messier than that. Names get respelled by clerks who could barely write. Branches die out, other branches multiply, and some of the prettiest family legends were invented by a proud grandchild 200 years after the fact. So take the order as a guide, not gospel. What is not in doubt is that every single name on this list was already living in colonial America before America had a name of its own. Number 20. Standish. This name belongs to Miles Standish, the small, hot-tempered military captain who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620 and became the chief soldier of Plymouth Colony. The surname itself is far older than that voyage. It comes from a village called Standish in Lancashire, England, and simply meant the stony pasture land near that village. Miles Standish carried an English farm name onto a beach 3,000 miles from that farm, and used it to organize the defense of a colony that had no walls, no soldiers, and almost no food. There are still Standishes across New England today, most of them with no idea their name once belonged to a patch of stony grass in the north of England. Number 19. Alden. John Alden was a young cooper hired to keep the barrels tight on the Mayflower's crossing, and by the time the ship reached land he had decided to stay rather than sail home. His name comes from the Old English personal name Ealdwine, meaning old friend, worn down over centuries into Alden. He married Priscilla Mullins, another passenger on that same ship, and their descendants spread so widely through New England that by some counts millions of living Americans can trace a line back to that one young barrel maker who was never even supposed to be a settler in the first place. Number 18. Winthrop. John Winthrop led the great migration of Puritans to Massachusetts Bay in 1630, arriving with 11 ships and hundreds of colonists in a single season. The surname is Old English, built from wine, meaning friend, and Thorpe, meaning a small settlement, so the name literally means friend's village. Winthrop delivered a sermon aboard his ship describing the new colony as a city upon a hill, a phrase that has been quoted by American politicians for 4 centuries since. The family he founded produced governors, scientists, and statesmen for generation after generation, all carrying a name that once described nothing more than a friendly little hamlet in the English countryside. Number 17. Bradford. William Bradford served as governor of Plymouth Colony for more than 30 years and wrote the single most important surviving account of the Pilgrim settlement, a manuscript called of Plymouth Plantation. The surname comes from a place name, the Broad Ford, a wide shallow crossing point on a river in Yorkshire. Bradford himself lost his first wife within weeks of landing, watched half his colony die in the first winter, and still kept a written record of every hardship in careful, steady handwriting. His descendants carried his surname across the growing colonies for the next 3.5 centuries. Number 16. Endicott. John Endicott arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1628, sent ahead of the main Puritan migration to prepare the ground, and became the colony's first governor. The name likely derives from an English place name meaning the cottage on the hill's end. Endicott was famously strict, famously humorless, and once cut a cross out of the English flag with his own sword because he considered it a symbol of popery. Whatever you think of the man, his surname sits at the very root of Massachusetts government, attached to a colony that still exists in law and memory 400 years later. Number 15. Dudley. Thomas Dudley crossed with Winthrop's fleet in 1630 and served multiple terms as governor of Massachusetts Bay. The surname is a place name too, from a town in the English Midlands, meaning Dudda's clearing, after an Anglo-Saxon landowner named Dudda who cleared that patch of forest centuries before any Dudley ever saw a ship. Thomas Dudley's daughter and Bradstreet became the first published poet in the English colonies, meaning this single family produced both a governor and the first recognized American poet within one generation of stepping off the boat. Number 14. Saltonstall. Richard Saltonstall was one of the wealthiest men to arrive with the Winthrop fleet, a landowner and founding patentee of the Massachusetts Bay Company itself. The surname comes from a place in Yorkshire, likely meaning the Willow Pool or the Salt Pool, depending on which local historian you ask, since the record here genuinely splits. What is certain is that the Saltonstall family held political office in Massachusetts almost continuously from the 1630s into the 20th century, a run of civic power lasting nearly 300 years under one unbroken surname. Number 13. Wentworth. The Wentworths became one of the most powerful families in colonial New Hampshire, producing multiple royal governors during the 1700s. The name is a place name from South Yorkshire, meaning the settlement of a man called Winthrop. Benning Wentworth, one of the family's governors, handed out so much New Hampshire land to friends and relatives that a whole region of what later became Vermont was nicknamed the New Hampshire Grants because of him. A single English farm name ended up stamped across thousands of acres of the American frontier. Number 12. Pierce. This one is quieter and far more common. Pierce comes simply from Piers, the medieval English form of Peter, meaning son of Peter. A Pierce family settled in Massachusetts in the 1630s, and the name spread widely enough across New England that by the 1800s it had produced the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce. Most Pierces alive today are not descended from any single famous ancestor. They are descended from dozens of separate men named after the Apostle Peter, all landing on the same coastline within a few decades of one another. Number 11. Coffin. Tristram Coffin arrived in Massachusetts around 1642 and later became one of the founding proprietors of Nantucket Island. The surname likely comes from the Old French word for a basket, which later narrowed in English to mean a burial box, a shift that has made this poor family cringe at their own name for centuries. On Nantucket, however, Coffin became a proud whaling dynasty name, tied to some of the most successful sea captains in American maritime history. It remains one of the most recognizable old family names on that island to this day. Number 10. Starbuck. Also from Nantucket, the Starbuck family were Quaker whaling merchants whose name almost certainly comes from an Old Norse place name meaning the stream by the stony ground, brought to England by Viking settlers centuries before any Starbuck saw open ocean. Herman Melville borrowed the name directly for the first mate in Moby Dick, and a modern coffee company borrowed it again more than a century later. Before any of that, it belonged to a real Quaker family hauling whale oil across the Atlantic from a tiny island off Massachusetts. Number 9. Folger. Another Nantucket whaling name, and a genuinely famous one, because Peter Folger's daughter Abia married a Boston candle maker named Josiah Franklin and gave birth to Benjamin Franklin. The surname likely comes from an Old French or English occupational root tied to fulling cloth, the process of cleaning and thickening wool. So somewhere behind the man who signed the Declaration of Independence stands a cloth worker's surname from a small English trade guild, carried across the ocean generations earlier. Number 8. Custis. The Custis family settled in Colonial, Virginia in the early 1600s, and the name is unusual because it likely traces to Dutch or Flemish roots rather than English ones, possibly from a family that passed through the Netherlands before crossing to America. Martha Washington was born Martha Dandridge but married into the Custis family first, becoming Martha Custis before she ever met George Washington. The name itself all but disappeared from common use, but it sits at the very center of the founding of the nation. Number 7. Rolfe. John Rolfe arrived at Jamestown in 1610, and two things about him changed the direction of American history. He figured out how to cultivate a sweeter strain of tobacco that could actually be sold profitably in England, saving the Virginia colony from financial collapse, and he married a young Powhatan woman named Pocahontas in 1614. The surname itself is Old English, likely from a personal name meaning wolf council. Their marriage produced descendants who later called themselves part of Virginia's first families, carrying both an English farm name and a Powhatan bloodline forward together. Number 6. Byrd. William Byrd I arrived in Virginia in the 1670s and built one of the great fortunes of the colony through trade, land, and the fur business. The surname is straightforward Old English, simply meaning bird, likely an early nickname for a small or quick-moving man. His son, William Byrd II, built Westover Plantation and kept detailed secret diaries of plantation life that historians still study today. The Byrd name went on to produce Virginia senators and governors for 2 more centuries after that first Atlantic crossing. Number 5. Randolph. The Randolph family became so central to Virginia's colonial aristocracy that they were later called the family that begot America. The surname comes from an Old Norman French and Germanic combination meaning shield wolf. William Randolph, who arrived in Virginia around 1670, married Mary Isham, and their children and grandchildren went on to include Thomas Jefferson, several signers of founding American documents, and generations of Virginia planters and politicians. Very few colonial surnames touch as many famous branches of American history as this one does. Number 4. Carter. Robert Carter, known in his own lifetime as King Carter for the sheer scale of his landholdings, arrived in Virginia in the mid-1600s and eventually controlled hundreds of thousands of acres. The surname is occupational, simply meaning a person who transported goods by cart, an ordinary medieval English trade name. From that ordinary root grew one of the largest private fortunes in colonial America, and the name carried forward into later generations that included a 20th-century American president who shared nothing but the surname with that first tobacco planter. Number 3. Lee. The Lee family settled in Virginia in the 1640s, and the surname is Old English, from Leah, meaning a woodland clearing or meadow, one of the most commonplace-based surname roots in the entire English language. Richard Lee I became a wealthy planter and colonial official, and his descendants included multiple signers of the Declaration of Independence, and, generations later, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. A word that once simply meant a clearing in the woods ended up attached to some of the most consequential names in American history. Number 2. Winslow. Edward Winslow crossed on the Mayflower in 1620 and became governor of Plymouth Colony on 3 separate occasions. The surname is a place name from Buckinghamshire, England, likely meaning a friend's burial mound or a friend's hill, depending on the Old English route you follow. Winslow negotiated directly with the Wampanoag leader Massasoit and helped keep an uneasy peace alive in the colony's earliest and most fragile years. His descendants remain prominent in New England public life for centuries, still carrying a name first attached to a hill in the English Midlands. Number 1. Adams. And here is the one that outlasts almost every family on this list in sheer influence. The Adams family settled in Braintree, Massachusetts in the 1630s, only a few years behind the very first Puritan migration. The surname is a simple patronymic, meaning son of Adam, one of the oldest and most universal name roots in the English language. From that quiet Massachusetts farming family came John Adams, the second President of the United States, his son John Quincy Adams, the 6th President, and generations of diplomats and writers after them. A name that once meant nothing more than son of the first man in the Bible ended up written twice into the list of American presidents. 20 names, 20 threads pulled tight across 4 centuries, running from a cooper on a leaking wooden ship, to a governor riding by candlelight through a killing winter, to a tobacco planter marrying into a native nation, to a farming family in Massachusetts that somehow produced 2 presidents. You did not choose your name any more than they did. It was handed to you, spelled 100 different ways by clerks who could barely write, worn down by 200 years of American accents, and passed on anyway. If your surname is on this list, tell me which colony your family landed in, and whether the story your grandparents told you turned out to be true, or turned out to be one of those pretty legends invented a few generations later. And if your name is not on this list, tell me what it is, where it came from, and how far back you have actually managed to trace it.